Thank you so much, Rudy, and thank you for Sovereign Health for supporting and providing this webinar series. Today, I appreciate everyone joining in and participating, and our goal is to look at family recovery through the lenses of attachment and trauma-informed care. Oftentimes in our process, in the families that we work with at Recovery 360, we found that our experience is that the identified patient often gets much of the focus and that the family system is often underserved or underrepresented in the change process until there's a predominant issue that arises in the recovery process. A little background for Recovery 360. We're an organization in the Denver metro area that serves a 90-mile radius around Denver. So we travel all the way up to Fort Collins, Colorado, to Colorado Springs, and directions east and west. Our background is a combined set of experiences with our team of over 55 years of clinical experience and practice, looking at recovery of mental health, addiction, both process and substance issues, as well as ongoing care for eating disorders and disordered eating care in the mental health field and behavioral health space. Our motivation and passion really is in helping systems, families, individuals, and communities to grow in their recovery efforts, to have the health and wellness that they deserve, seek, and wish to flourish in. Our primary services are described in a few categories. Our fundamental philosophy comes from the approach of psychosocial rehabilitation or psychiatric rehabilitation, as it's often noted. And our primary method of support for people entering recovery is to be that team collaborator, that recovery Sherpa, with someone in their recovery as a part of a collaborative process with a therapist, medical provider, family, and other systems support, which we'll outline and discuss through our presentation today. We offer counseling for families, couples, and individuals as well in mental health and recovery processes around addiction, both process and substance. And we do this in a unique way, both in homes, in the community, and in offices. So our approach is really to be able to meet where the client is in their lives and partner with the client in the process, whether that be in a traditional setting for individual therapy in an office or for family or couples work in a client's home, and in particular with the psychosocial rehabilitation perspective of really partnering with someone in their journey to be with them throughout the steps of their process. We're here today really to look at family recovery. And the first question that we really need to identify is, who are we treating? Most often what occurs is an identified patient ends up in a practice in an outpatient setting or a residential setting that you may be a part of, and that person receives the primary attention. The way that we like to describe that is to really look at, what caused or inspired the change that an individual or family is looking for. And more often than not, what occurs in our experience is that that identified patient receives most of the attention, and then as other parts of their system become aware, become connected, and become involved, we start to take a different perspective. So from our perspective at Recovery 360, we're really trying to understand who the identified patient is, what immediate family members are connected to that individual, and the immediate family members can range in different family systems. So we're trying to broaden the perspective and say it's not just that person in the treatment process, but really all of the systems connected to them in the layers that make up their lives. We look at extended family. So from immediate family, whether it be a parent as the identified patient, or a child as an identified patient, or a grandparent as an identified patient, who is connected in their extended family system? What are the parents and the grandparents or uncles in an immediate family circle that are really directly connected and affected by the issues driving that person to seek and accept treatment? We also want to include looking at the bigger support systems that are present for an identified patient within their system. So being able to look at other portions, whether that be mutual aid support, peers, 12-step sponsorship, close friends, mentors, co-workers, everything that really comprises a network that really ultimately builds what is someone's family system. So our answer to the question of who are we treating is really everyone, and that we really need to account for that from the very beginning of someone's experience entering the recovery process. To do so, it's incredibly helpful to look from our perspective at the impacts of addiction and what occurs in systems. So if we take an example of a parent, say a spouse, a father, who has developed a substance use progression of addiction, and look at how that impacts a family system, what we often see is role confusion, where children in that family system start to have their roles challenged as that father's addiction continues to progress. Roles change very quickly. We define a healthy family system by saying the parents serve the needs of the child or children in a family system, in a healthy family system. And in an unhealthy family system, the child or children serve the needs of a parent or parental unit. So the role confusion that comes up as addiction progresses often appears very subtly and very slowly, but becomes very recognizable for a child in a system with an alcoholic father, for example. We look at how parentification can occur, where in a multiple sibling family system, the oldest child starts to take on those responsibilities that would be occupied by an alcoholic or addicted father in the role in the family system, and how from a developmental standpoint that really does start to create challenges to trauma and attachment relationships. We start to look deeply at how a child becomes an emotional spouse in the circumstance of a father's addiction progressing, where that oldest sibling will become the confidant for a mother or a partner in an addicted family system, and really starts to exacerbate that role confusion and parentification, really challenging those developmental milestones that a child may be meeting, and adding to confusion around poor boundaries, about really being able to have unclear expectations, no expectations, and often unrealistic expectations as an addiction continues to grow and impact a family and challenge. The net result in this process is the dysfunctional family roles really do become defined, and become defined over time, but often very quickly. The classic family roles from Sharon Wegscheider-Cruz of the hero, the lost child, the scapegoat, the rescuer, and the mascot quickly become defined and become developmental impacts for children in a family system with an alcoholic parent. What we see very classically, and many of you experience and work with, I'm sure, are those roles persist in a family system. So if we consider that the identified patient is receiving the bulk of attention, we're not necessarily paying attention to how those roles are really presenting themselves in a family system. We like to look at the 28 laundry list characteristics of ACOA, or adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunctional families, as looking at specific behaviors that we can identify very early in an identified client system to be able to see who's occupying what role, and how do we need to attend to that as care providers in that person, that system. Being able to see how people-pleasing of the hero, of wanting to be present, and how that role confusion continues to grow. Being able to see the impact of how poor boundaries really cause people to develop characterological concerns, misappropriated filters and perspectives on themselves, being able to impact esteem and their relational strategies as they grow from childhood through young adulthood into adulthood, and carry those relational strategies all the way through. We see how controlling behaviors can evidence themselves differently in each of those roles, and how they manifest themselves in an entire system, and what are the rules for those systems that have evolved. When we look at trauma in current family systems that have addiction or a mental health concern, we need to take a moment to distinguish something very critical from our perspective in looking at treating family systems. To look at big T traumas, as they're often referred to, or single event traumas that are often overt, those things like DUIs, removal from the home that can occur, whether it be through separation, through children being removed from the home by social services, or a spouse being asked to leave because of physical or emotional abuse in and of itself, or a separation and divorce process, and see those as traumatic events that the whole system experiences and experiences differently. We want to contrast that or relate that to little t traumas, or those small developmental traumas that happen persistently that aren't single event. The challenging roles and boundaries, the impacts of parentification and role confusion, the development of dysfunctional family roles that are often covert and implicit. Those roles that people occupy and learn how to respond that create that classic sense of the family dysfunction, the family secrets, the fact that people in alcoholic and addicted family systems in particular develop that classic phrase of don't think, don't talk, and don't feel as a rule for living. All of those combined together over time really create developmental impacts to all family members, regardless of the single nature of a source or a single event happening. And what we experience often is being able to differentiate and see what are those little t and big T traumas and what are their relationships in a family system. We try to account for transgenerational patterns of trauma that are passed down that may go multi-generationally. Seeing how a particular change to a family system can have a single event trauma, a big T trauma, or a persistent set of little t traumas pass over time that get ultimately handed down in the character development and personality expression of each individual in a family system, and how those pass from generation to generation, setting the stage for what becomes a person's family of origin, regardless if the onset of addiction is present or the onset of a mental health issue is present, from the instantiation of a family. All of these things combine to help us look at how do attachment wounds occur, how are they created, how are they manifested, and how are they constantly created and recreated in a family system as big T traumas and little t traumas interact with each other through a person's lifetime. What we see is that disconnection without reconnection, and it can be both in larger trauma settings such as DUI, removal from a home, persistent physical abuse that turns into emotional abuse over time, and how the addiction process and impacts of mental health really do create a lack of repair and connection in the process. And when we look together with all of these things, we start to see how a system evolves and is effective. To introduce a helpful set of tools and perspectives in looking at the entire system and how we can start to account for treatment and care differently, I'd like to share SAMHSA's matrix model, 8 phases of addiction in response to the family members. And as you can see by the picture, we have that early phase, the introduction of what happens when addiction starts. And these 8 phases have corresponding videos that are free to download, and there's a link for the resource in the PowerPoint presentation available for everyone, that have interviews of both an addicted person in recovery and the family members throughout each stage, talking about their experiences in the ongoing recovery process. But in the beginning, as we look at this picture, we see people having fun. There's a lack of awareness on family members' parts about the progression of substance use in an individual's lives. And strange or odd behavior is often ignored or dismissed in the process as just, oh, that's just how they are in life. As addiction continues to progress and the maintenance stages of a person's substance use really start to take hold, what we see in family systems is bargaining and control and enabling that gets expressed, and being able to deal with some of the things that occur as a natural progression of addiction. That stage of adaptation or maladaptation of where the family system starts to experience role challenges, boundary challenges, that idea that the addiction specifically starts to take control and power away from all members of the family in a system. We move on to the disenchantment stage, where consequences are no longer avoided or can be denied, where the progression of impacts to a person's employment, legal issues start mounting, physical and emotional abuse become persistent and not just present, boundary violations that occur, role challenges that are identified, become the norm in a family system, start to create the anger, hurt, guilt, and shame that a family member experiences. And often what we see in our experience is that a family member will start to take responsibility for the progression of someone's addiction by blaming themselves or focusing on a loved one within that system, whether it's the identified patient or not. The next stage is the disaster stage, that physical and emotional separation that happens during the crisis that often leads people to seek treatment. It can manifest itself in a diverse set of ways, and in your own experiences as care providers and practitioners, I'm sure you have thousands of examples of what the disaster phase looks like. But for a family member, that's the point at which they become completely cut off from the person they know and love, as the addiction really has manifested into a disease progression. And the behaviors that are unhealthy are the responsive behaviors that a family member has engaged and tried to make adaptive to respond to the increasing threat, the increasing progression, and the increasing response of an addiction in a person's life in a family system. If we look at this picture for a moment, we see 3 of 4 of the members of the family really enjoying themselves and having a great time, but I'd like to focus on the young man clutching to the protection bar and having a much different experience. The withdrawal stage of the progression for addiction and family members is often that point when a person enters a treatment process and begins to receive care. But for family members, that's different. For an identified person receiving addiction treatment that is entering a detox setting, whether ambulatory or residential, and starting to learn to separate from the substance that's contributing to the progression of their addiction. For a family member, it really is that separation from the person from the addiction, and the separation from that crisis and that motivating piece for a family member that really does require psychoeducation about addiction as a disease and how does this affect the family. Because for practical intensive purposes, once an identified client begins a treatment process, the family member's quote-unquote drug of choice becomes that individual. So their health, safety, and welfare becomes the focus, and often family members aren't paying attention to their own impacts, their own changes in their own process, separate from the progression of the addiction of the identified client. As recovery begins to build, the honeymoon stage, the early abstinence of often the residential component of treatment or an early outpatient process of treatment for an identified client, begins to address changes to old routines. They start to talk more openly about their personal struggles. They start to engage recovery activities through therapy, through mutual aid support, through direct change. And that honeymoon period is just that for a family system of seeing the crisis that brought that person to a treatment process, to a care provider such as yourself or a group that you work in, is that period of elation. They're safe, they're secure, they're being tended to, their needs are being attended to, but the family member's needs may not be fully accounted for. As a person's recovery process continues to grow, there is a wall stage during ongoing and protracted abstinence, and that can begin post-residential treatment, for example, and last anywhere from that 60-day mark all the way up to 4 to 6 months of an individual's early recovery, where people in the family experienced improved communication, begin to work on the resentments and anger that were initiated through the addictive process, and family members become willing to look at repairing relationships. They start to see the identified client making change and developing some consistency, but are still very hurt, very hesitant, and very full of their own emotional and relational strategies, looking to see, can they trust this process, can they trust that recovery? And that wall stage for a person in addiction recovery is often met with some struggle, some challenges, some desires that may include, things that lead towards a behavioral relapse or ultimately a chemical relapse in an addiction recovery process. So continuing with family and individual recovery and really bringing that together becomes a critical focus. But if we notice, we're talking about stage 7 at that point, where the reality is that the identified patient is receiving most of the services, not all, hopefully, but is further along in the security and development of their foundation in recovery. And a family member may just be getting involved and just start to become more invested in their own recovery at that point. We often like to say that it takes family members twice as long to get into their own recovery as the identified patient, because the focus of most care systems is on the identified patient. The next stage is the adjustment and resolution stage, where we look at long-term life changes and recovery goals, both the identified patient and the family members in the entire system. And hopefully at this point we're really looking at what does the entire system need to have recovery be more than just that one individual, the addicted person, enter a long-term recovery. And there's no real time frames associated with it like other stages, because it really is an individual effort on every member of a family system, including the identified client. But being able to attend to those long-term life goals and recovery goals together as one and not distinguish them as separate for a family member becomes incredibly powerful. And again, you can download these resources and their corresponding videos with sections for the identified client and the family member with examples of real family members talking about their own experience in each of these processes. To take all this information forward, a really helpful tool that we're very large advocates of is the Family Informed Trauma Treatment Model, or FIT model, presented and advocated from the University of Maryland. And this description, and this slide in particular to share with everyone, is really to outline how the traumatic context and attachment context of relationships in the development of a family system as a mental health or addictive process is growing really leads to family outcomes. And it really is meant to highlight, looking at how many different roles and how many different relationships are connected. That a family system isn't really a linear process. And so to incorporate trauma-informed and attachment-informed principles to family care really needs to look at how does that traumatic context really work. As we look from transgenerational trauma to single event trauma, the big T trauma we identified, the little t trauma, and how all of the complex relationships exist in a family system that really need to be accounted for as we're looking at building recovery for an entire family system. So we really love this model because it fits in with the systems approach and really attends to looking at all the context in a person's recovery, not just an abstinence-based substance addiction recovery, but looking at the greater impact of what are the needs for a family system to develop true health and flourishing in a long-term recovery process. So looking at family-informed trauma treatment, we start by having it be family-centered as the founding principle, really looking not just at that identified patient, not just at immediate family members, but that entire range of relationships that are there, and having that be the center and driving principle in balance in attending to everyone's needs as recovery manifests and grows. Specifically, as noted, that it takes family members sometimes up to twice as long to enter their own personal recovery. We want it to be empowering family members from that family-centered perspective. So being able to start to look at each family member, looking at their own recovery needs, and developing their own concept of recovery based on their role and relationship within a family system. Family-informed trauma treatment addresses developmental needs of all family members, not just children per se, where a parent is the person entering recovery or that identified client, but also looking at that person's role in their immediate family and that transgenerational approach to say, what are the developmental needs that were impacted by the progression of addiction for an individual such as an identified client and the family members who've experienced traumatic events or traumatic responses as a result of the progression of addiction or a mental health concern in a system. So it's really critical for us to to keep in mind that in family-informed trauma treatment, it really does attend to all of those issues. We're looking to promote safety for all family members and prevent exposure to further traumas. Really looking at optimizing strengths in the process from a family's cultural or ethnic background, religious or spiritual affiliation, and beliefs to support recovery. So looking at what already exists in a family system and not overly focus on quote-unquote problem areas, but really looking and trying to optimize what's already in someone's entire system that we can use to build and grow a strong and healthy foundation to be able to create the kind of safety that does cessate further traumas from evolving. We look to link families to essential community resources. And from the perspective of psychosocial rehabilitation in particular, the role of psychosocial rehabilitation providers really is looking at how do we as care managers in a person's process or recovery Sherpas connect them to the kinds of resources that are available. And those community resources can range from therapy to spiritual supports to mutual aid supports, family support groups, individual concerns around things like NAMI, for example, in the mental health world, more than just, say, Al-Anon or Nar-Anon in the 12-step family mutual aid perspective, or ACOA, but looking at what unique resources exist in a person's community to be able to link the entire family to all the resources that can support their ongoing recovery. We want to look at educating families on the signs of post-traumatic stress as a part of family-informed trauma treatment in particular, to be able to identify when those traumas are being reactivated. So we account for that in treatment planning and care as providers ourselves, or within a person's support system to be able to identify what relational work may need to be attended to, and how does it affect the entire family. If there's stress in a parental unit, for example, in during recovery, how does that affect children? How do the relationships with parents or grandparents impact or support that? We want to include family-informed trauma assessments and evidence-based treatments that actively engage all family members. And probably my favorite example of that is using something like the Adult Attachment Inventory with all family members, looking at evidence-based practices such as EMDR for individual therapy, but looking at a modality such as the trauma dynamics approach to look at working with a family system or internal family systems modalities, to really be able to look at how are we assessing the traumatic components for each individual in the family system and the family system as a whole. And there are a lot of wonderful resources out there, the Adult Attachment Inventory being one example. We look to help families in learning how to communicate differently, helping family members talk together about their traumatic experiences, not to relive them, but to learn how to resolve them, to move past them, and to create safety and trust in a family system where a mental health or addiction impact has occurred, and how they were impacted together, really helping people start to understand as an entire family system what were the dynamics and what are the dynamics that are present as someone enters and continues to heal in a recovery process, whether that's a family member, an identified client, or someone in their support system. Something really critical and important from our perspective is really that we want to attend to everyone in a family system or in a person system, from the smallest to the tallest, where no one's left behind. We really advocate the perspective in family-informed trauma treatment that, you know, it's not just no child left behind, it's no individual in that system left behind, because everyone deserves recovery, regardless of the outcomes of an identified client's treatment or a family member's treatment experiences. Everybody in that system deserves to have a stable ongoing recovery where happiness and flourishing are an expected part of their life as they grow. As a tool to start to help create that, the psychosocial rehabilitation perspective in particular looks at something, and many of you may be familiar with this from your own work, of developing a family recovery map and the tool of using a wellness assessment wheel. And this particular example of a wellness wheel comes out of the UCLA model of psychosocial or psychiatric rehabilitation. And it's a really helpful tool from that systems perspective to start to look at how do we start creating a family recovery map, not just around the individual or identified client, but the entire system, by exploring each of the areas in here. And so for a brief description, the slice of our wheel noted recovery includes mental health, includes physical wellness, includes areas of concern around substance use and co-occurring issues, but it's a much wider definition of recovery in that sense. We look at social and interpersonal strengths and areas of concern for each individual in the family system, so we start to understand the connections in their support systems. We look at recreation and what are people doing, not just for fun, but what are people doing in the family system together or independently for their own recovery and their own health and wellness in terms of satisfaction and leisure. Under self-management, the classic issues of money, stuff, and time, all the things that we all needed to do to get ready to be on this webinar together, to be able to look at organizing those areas and understanding the needs for each individual person in a family system, to look at family relationships specifically and account for each person's perspective and each person's developmental and relational needs in that, to look at vocation and education in and of itself, and what are opportunities for growth or development. Not just what is somebody currently involved in, but what does each individual really want to have in their lives as a part of that. And really looking together at belief systems of each family member, because a family may have a spiritual center, but each person may experience it very differently. And in a larger context, there may be multiple sources of belief systems that can be accounted for and need to be accounted for to look at a strengths-based perspective in helping someone develop a recovery map. So we really like to sit down with each family member in a system as they're open and welcome in the process and investing, and look at the 7 domains of functioning to help start to create that map. We want people to really envision, imagine, and dream, and look at what is it that they want to have in their lives. Oftentimes people will do this through experiential exercises such as a vision board for each family member, but what does each individual want for themselves, for their family, and for the people connected in their system, whether that's supports that are external, such as a mutual aid 12-step sponsor or probation, for an identified client. They don't necessarily want to need a probation officer, or for that possibility that there's something missing in their system that they want to develop more support. So we really advocate that the sky's the limit, and that we want people to include in this process of using the wellness wheel and creating a family map to envision individually and collectively as a system. So how will we get there? How will we help an individual family member and a whole family system to get there? The tools that we really have found to be most effective in this process, and this can be included in really specific treatment planning for an identified client, or a partnership, a couple's work, or an entire family system treatment plan, is to really look at SMART goals. And most people are familiar, but just a quick review, that's really goals that are specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-related. And those are both individual and for the family system itself in creating those treatment plans and those ongoing care plans. The more attainable some things for someone and the more concrete and connected, the more opportunity there is to create that trust and safety that enhances a family recovery. We look at identifying resources and supports that are already in place within an individual's life and their system and the family system as a whole, to look at what are assets that already exist that are present, and to help them identify other sources or resources that they may have immediate access to but may need support to engage differently, or to help them develop that perspective of creating a new resource in their life that they may be hesitant to for a variety of reasons, which can include some of those roles that we talked about early on. A hero in a family system is less likely to ask for help. A lost child is oftentimes much more approachable and engageable in looking to create new systems. We want to come from the perspective of not just being solution-focused, but solution-oriented. So the goal is to problem-solve barriers to the instantiation and execution of someone's goals, and look at the steps along the way that are really necessary for someone in that process. So problem solving the barriers that would stop someone, in a traditional motivational interviewing style, is to really understanding what stage of change are they in, and what are those things that might stop them from being able to have their dreams. And we begin to see the connection of how important it is to have an individual's and a family's, real imagination and dreams invested in this process of creating their goals and their continued care in their recovery. And from all that, creating a concrete plan that everyone can assent to. So keeping each individual goal manageable and boundary really clear in that process, and being able to make the leap from the small fishbowl to the larger fishbowl, to be able to have the kind of relationships and have the kind of recovery that each person in a family system really wants to develop. To give a good example of putting this all into practice, I'd like to share a case example from the family-informed trauma perspective that I've shared, and the psychosocial rehabilitation model of the Clark family. The Clark family received home-based services from Recovery 360, and we've changed the names and some of the details for confidentiality and anonymity in the process. But if we take a look at this picture and look at this family system, and we say, there are several components and several generations in this family system. In this family system, the mother was identified as the person receiving, the identified patient who ended up in a residential treatment setting and was referred to us for ongoing care as a part of her continuing care plan. What the mom realized very quickly is that there were issues in her immediate family system with her and her husband that she wanted to address, issues that affected their children, and that one of their biggest supports were definitely her parents and his parents in the process, her husband's parents. So we have 3 generations really quickly engaged in this system. And we're able to start to help them develop a real family map of saying what were the resources available to them. If we use this picture as an example and we start to look at it, the grandparents were incredibly supportive, but there were some liability and asset concerns that needed to be fleshed out very early on in the process. If you take just a cold look at this picture and look at the relationships of who's standing in what place and how are they supporting the different family members, one might look at the grandmother in this photo and see how closely she's supporting what perceivably could be the youngest child. Why is she standing next to who might be her daughter? What is the role of the relationships between the son and the mom as the identified patient? Where the younger daughter is close to her father, and the grandfather in this picture really looks apart, but also looks a little separated and distant in his own relationship. So being able to use the fit family map as an idea, or at least a template to start to understand those relationships, really can help enhance an experience. And that's exactly in the Clark family what occurred. There was a pattern of generational matriarchy in the family, as the grandmother and the identified patient is the mom, being the sources of power and control in the family system, and that men in that family system were often expected to be not necessarily subservient, but expected to yield to the maternal rule of the family system. So being able to look at the developmental needs of a children in such a system with a mom entering recovery and what those relationships turned out to be was really important. In the Clark family example, the children were in the 8 to 12 range and the 12 to 16 range when the mom entered treatment. So there were different developmental needs that were really present as mom entered recovery and started inviting other family members to the system. We look at, from the trauma and attachment perspective, some of the transgenerational patterns that had existed and how, in the grandparents' family system, there was an unexpected overt and covert trauma of the family becoming very wealthy and very successful in that generation, and how money, time, and stuff really played an impact in both the mom's own experience and her developmental needs growing up, to her creating a family with her husband and being able to build that, and how some of those transgenerational patterns really needed to be addressed in their family system as a part of their recovery as a family. And thankfully, all the family were able to bring different components of that into their treatment process, both through individual, couples, and family therapy in their system. And we're able to identify how each of them experienced that wealth that created in the prior generation was an issue and ongoing concern for them in their own recovery efforts. So we look at tools and interventions in this perspective, and we start to see in this picture a different set of arrangements and a different set of relationships. And you can perceive it in your own interpretation of what some of the changes were. So we look at being able to begin, again, with psychoeducation on addiction, on codependency, on trauma and attachment, and on the recovery process as a whole, not just for the identified patient, but for the entire system. We start to look at boundaries that need to be reset, clarified, and sometimes built. As we identified that in an alcoholic or addicted home, there are often shifting, no, or unrealistic expectations that become the boundary crossing violations that make up little t traumas, and start to account not just for their experiencing, but helping families to create and recreate healthy boundaries. And the greatest tool for being able to do that is looking at communication. We really advocate in our process of family-informed trauma treatment the speaker-listener technique, or mirroring, as it's often referred to, of really helping people learn how to communicate effectively, to be able to look at what I thought, what I experienced, and what I feel in response to someone else's actions, and really helping people be able to hear that and to receive it and not be activated, not to have re-traumatization or to raise someone's defense system, so that trust and safety become the norm in communication. And that really is done in lots of different levels and lots of different ways, from an individual entering recovery, learning how to communicate with their mutual aid support, such as a sponsor, and where those boundaries are, to a couple or a marriage or partnership, and what do those boundaries look like. You know, the operations of looking at boundaries with children that are affected developmentally, and how role changes and de-parentification often needs to take place. So parents learning how to set healthy boundaries with children, and learning how to set healthy boundaries with their own family system. And in the Clark family example, a lot of work was done to be able to understand that a lot of implicit boundaries had been built that were really unhealthy in their system. We look at community-based and natural supports. So what are the supports that already exist in someone's lives that they can access and resource differently, whether it be neighbors, teachers, whether that be spiritual or religious communities in someone's life, and how they can access not just resources, but to build their system and diversify it. Because the more diverse someone's system is, the more tools that they have as an individual and as a family, the stronger their foundation and the faster their execution of being able to live their dreams and have that happy, flourishing life is. We found, in particular in the Clark system, that neighbors were an incredibly important part of the immediate family unit, and were family of choice in many instances, and close relationships, and how much of a wonderful resource that the neighbors were for the Clark family in being able to grow, in being able to create safety, trust, and in being able to really have the flourishing that everyone in the system deserved and wanted. And specifically, we start to look at referrals in a family-informed trauma treatment process a little bit differently. We look at what family programs are there available for lots of different types of issues, or whatever's present on multiple levels. Oftentimes that is for a residential treatment program, that family week or family weekend. But beyond that, looking at family support systems, family therapy, opportunities such as example listed for the Betty Ford's Children's Program. And for those of you not familiar with it, you can Google that, and here in the Denver metro area, we're fortunate to have them as a resource, where they work with children ages 5 to 18 in their process, specifically looking at ages 5 to 12 and being able to help educate and bring understanding of addiction and recovery to a younger children's set. Being able to look at mutual aid resources such as Al-Anon, ACOA, CODA, and NAMI, as I had mentioned a little earlier, but looking for those specific referrals to help people create a network of support on different levels for both their individual concerns and needs and for the family system as a whole. We are very much advocates and proponents of being able to have the right level of therapy for each individual and the right level of therapy for a system and the right resources that everybody can receive and feel comfortable, safe, and operationally successful in as they continue to mature. And in the Clark family, that took some time to evolve and develop, to really be able to identify at different times what was most appropriate for the husband and wife to do individual therapy with their respective providers, to be able to do couples therapy to work on their healing in their relationship, and to be able to look at the opportunities for multi-generational family therapy which occurred in the process. To sum up what we've been able to share and take a very fast-paced journey through and looking at family systems, we've looked at the role of trauma-informed and attachment-informed practices regarding family systems. We've been able to look at some specific tools and interventions and resources to help families understand their own process and start to identify that. We looked at a specific model of family-informed trauma treatment as a lens and started to provide tools that you as providers and care team members can begin to use immediately, such as the Wellness Wheel assessment as an opportunity to do family mapping and to enhance your own practice and treatment planning with the folks that you serve in your community. And at this time, I'd like to open up for questions and discussion. Thank you for your attendance and participation to this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jonathan. That was a great presentation, Ms. Say. Okay, we are just going to start our question answer session. So this is a reminder for all of who's attending this webinar. You can still use your chat box to send your questions if you have any to ask to speaker today. Okay, John, we have a question from Kevin. Kevin Brown, he wants to ask, how would you recommend incorporating these strategies in high school settings?
That's a really great question. And I would say that from a high school setting standpoint, being able to look at how your current school counseling services already engage some of these resources, whether that be looking at the screening tools that you already use that may include some of these resources. And most specifically, you may want to engage the Wellness Wheel with your students as a way of starting to help them understand their own lives as you're working with them. When working with family systems, to be able to do the same thing, to start to introduce the concept that it's not necessarily about one individual in the identified patient, but really the entire system. And I think from a high school's vantage point, that you have a wonderful opportunity as a resource that's already in both a parent's lives and a family's lives and a child's life as a student to be able to introduce those concepts. One thing I know that I've experienced in the past is being able to find people who do family systems practice and trauma-informed treatment and bring them in to the high school as educational sponsors for discussions and panels. And that might be a great way to look at it from a systems perspective to introduce, say, a family informed trauma treatment process into a high school setting.
Okay, thank you, John. Moving on to the next question. We have a next question from Leroy. The family circles and the extended circles, what is applicable and not?
Well, I think that really depends on the individual. I think everything should be included and explored, and then each relationship within that. Because every family system is so completely different, and I'll use mine as an example, where family of choice and neighbors were an incredible part of my family system. Teachers in my lifetime were incredibly important to me, but community resources weren't necessarily a part of that. It really depends on the individual and the relationship specifically, so really understanding say from my perspective as a person in recovery, what my relationships with teachers were and how important they were to me, what relations with my neighbors were and how important they were to me really comes into perspective. I had a guidance counselor, for example, who was incredibly influential and very supportive. And I also had a probation officer at one point in my own experience as a, addicted young man and a person in recovery now, who I had a very trusting relationship with. So it really comes down to widening that circle from the beginning and then narrowing down and zeroing in based on, working with an individual to understand what is their true system as opposed to the traditional systems that we often get trained in as providers and clinicians. So I think being able to access each level from a person's understanding and then engaging each of those and deciding what boundaries are healthy. And certainly from a therapy perspective, there are obviously legal boundaries with releases of information and confidentiality that needed to be attended to from the HIPAA and 42 CFR perspective, but really understanding what is that role and is it healthy or unhealthy for that individual.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving on to the next question. Can we apply these stages of change to family members? How would that work if they are at different stages?
Well, I think it's a great question, and again, I think that it really, those 8 stages really are the family member stages, and they correspond with what a person who's going through an addictive process is experiencing, and they're happening simultaneously. I think it really depends on being able to understand each individual, and again, that's where that family map is extremely helpful in understanding what stage someone's in. But I think that's really driven by the person you're working with or the system you're working with. And my favorite question is to sit down with a family and go through each of those stages and have them identify where they believe they are and have that dialogue within a family system that may include differing perspectives of where someone believes that the entire system may be in that recovery process. Those videos that are on the SAMHSA website are free for download. The link brings you to YouTube, so they're public accessible, are often great resources to be able to help families walk through that process to accomplish having them decide what stage are they in. And I think when it comes to those differences of perspective of, I think we're in stage 6, but, the identified client in the system says we're in stage 8, really makes for great discussion of arriving at those goals together of where communication and boundary can be grown. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. So next question is from Michelle. When the IP is resistant to entering a program of recovery, do you continue to focus on the family and engage them in programs of recovery and separating from the resistant IP?
Absolutely. I think, again, from the smallest to the tallest in the family system, even if someone hasn't entered a treatment process, that identified patient, really starting with the family member as an identified individual is absolutely necessary and often helps them learn how to deliver or set boundaries to promote health as opposed to re-traumatizing. So engaging a family member wherever they are, whether that individual, the addicted individual or the person with the mental health concern is willing, is participant in treatment or not, helping the family will grow the health of that system, absolutely. And I think you really need to explore piece by piece and being able to help them learn what's healthy for them and build their own recovery first in that process. And as a natural result of their own recovery, developing the boundaries that are often associated with an intervention or a process will become relevant. And those often speed up the process for people entering, that identified client, entering a treatment process in doing that. Sometimes that process can be years, and sometimes it can be very, very quickly. But it really is contingent on the family member developing their own recovery. So we absolutely support, I would say 1,000%, continuing to work with the family, even if an identified patient is unwilling.
Okay, the next question is from Roberto. First of all, he wants to thank for the training, and then his question is, how can we apply this how can we apply this to situations where the IP is a youth who is not motivated to be in treatment, for example, required by probation, but family is engaged in recovery?
Well, I think, again, a great question. Thank you, Roberto. I think keeping the framework organizationally is really important. So even if someone is externally motivated, such as a young adult or an adolescent, and the family system is engaged, is an incredible opportunity to be able to help that whole system develop the resources, even with resistance. If we look at trying to meet people where they are in a system, and even attending to that external motivation, like probation or a legal requirement for a young person, continuing to help and support the family by developing their resources and looking at their own recovery process and continue to enhance that, at some point there will be that disaster stage that will come up for the young adult in the system, where the resources will be present. And my experience is continuing to offer those resources, but taking that motivational interview strategy of rolling with resistance at a certain level because of the external motivation of a young adult is actually the most successful path that I've experienced. Not pushing something on them, not including it as a legal requirement, although oftentimes family therapy or individual therapy and counseling is a part of a probation-motivated experience for a young adult, but really leaving the door open for them to become willing, but to be able to have the natural results. I'm not a big fan of the word consequences, but the natural results of their actions and boundaries held to standard in a healthy way.
Okay, moving on to our last question this session. We have a question from Virginia. Question is, what worked best for young children?
I think with young children in particular, being able to engage things like play therapy in particular, which I've had a lot of success in working with specific therapists around that, is actually incredibly helpful. Again, with young children, being able to think of young children from the ages of, say, 2 to 8 in particular, there are resources like I mentioned, the Betty Ford's Children Program, for example, for children a little bit older to engage. But I think being able to use play therapy as a doorway of meeting, their needs where they are with their ability to integrate into support is what I've experienced in a family systems model to be really, really successful. And if those resources aren't necessarily available to you in your community, being able to find specialty resources that are, and being able to engage in an open process with the family and to keep them included. And if they're very young children in that first 3 years of life, operationally, really helping educate the parents and siblings that might be in that system or grandparents in that system around things like developmental stages, around attachment, healthy attachment and attachment building as opposed to creating attachment wounds, is another great opportunity of really helping someone be clear about what they want to continue to build from a family systems perspective. But I would say for those younger children, play therapy is one of the most powerful things. And it's really amazing what the observations that young children will bring into an experience that are really informative for, say, a parent entering recovery. A lot of times they are the bearers of the most direct truth in the most open and loving way.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for the wonderful presentation. We have a comment from Christina. She said, I don't have any questions, but I am a CPS co-worker and I'm also in recovery. I'm glad I attended this webinar. My family and I went through all this step by step. I was like, it was my story. And watching this, I can now help my clients to identify where they are when they go through this process. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm so grateful to be able to be here and for you for sharing that and being with us.
Thank you so much. And I must say, very nice answers. And moving on to the next slide. Thank you everyone who is attending this webinar. Thank you for your participation and joining us today. If you have any further questions, please feel free to send them to webinar@solvehealth.com. I repeat, webinar@solvehealth.com. Whatever questions are left, we will respond to those via email. If you have any questions related to CE certificate, please send in your queries at j.lisalda@solvehealth.com. I repeat, j.lisalda@solvehealth.com. After the webinar finishes, you will receive a thank you email within 48 hours with all the information pertaining to this webinar. We will also send you the CE instructions to download your CE certificate. And this presentation will be available to watch after 72 hours on solveinstitute.com. So you can watch it again over there. And most of our attendees are facing problems downloading their CE certificate. So here I'm telling you the step-by-step process how you can download your CE certificate. So first of all, you just need to go on solveinstitute.com, and the page look like this. This is the home page of the solveinstitute.com. When you land here, you just need to register yourself, and if you have already registered with us, you just need to enter your email ID and password and sign in. After signing in, you will land on the next page where you can find lots of presentations. You just need to select the presentation you want to watch. After pressing the presentation you want to watch, you will land on the next page. Yeah, here you can see the abstract, like all the information pertaining to that webinar, and here you can press continue to video button. After pressing continue to video button, you can watch the video, and then you will land on the next page. That will be a quiz section. You have to answer all the quiz question, and you need to submit the feedback form in order to generate your CE certificate. If you further have any questions, you can send in your queries at webinar@solvehealth.com. I'll be more than happy to answer your queries. Thank you so much for your participation and joining us today. We hope you found this information valuable. Have a great rest of your week, and we look forward to bring more interesting webinars each month. So keep joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone.